Order, order. Welcome to this International Development Committee evidence session. Today we will hear from Jillian Popkins, the government's preferred candidate for Chief Commissioner of the Independent Commission of Aid Impact. And Jillian, can we begin by asking you to briefly introduce yourself and set out your professional background?
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me say what a privilege it is to have been nominated and to be here and have got this far in the process. I know the IDC to be a very expert and experienced committee on international development, so I'm looking forward to the conversation. I believe you've all seen my CV, so I won't rehearse the detail of that, but perhaps just to say that the sort of golden thread, the focus of all my work, whether it's been overseas in the UK in policy or programmes, in the international NGO sector with government, or in partnerships, has been poverty and using human rights-based approaches in a practical way to reach the poorest people and to ensure that their rights are upheld to advance social justice. So that's been the driving motivation of my work for 3 decades. And through doing that, I've seen firsthand the absolute importance of learning and evidence because it's a difficult thing that we do. It's a complex thing that we do in development. And there's always more to learn and always more that can be achieved through learning. So that's also been a motivation for me. And I think that that's more important than ever at a point where we are so off track to meet the SDGs, where there are so many barriers to the acceleration of progress towards the SDGs, and where in the global and, of course, in the UK context, there's such pressure on such fiscal pressure and declining public support for the very important work of aid. So, I'm very pleased to have been nominated and would hope to really bring my the breadth and depth of my experience to advance the scrutiny and aid impact agenda.
Thank you. Ryan.
Right, Jillian, thank you for being here. If you're appointed as Chief Commissioner, what will your priorities for the Independent Commission for Aid Impact be, both in the short and the long term?
Yes, so, my overarching priority will be to set the 4th Commission up for success. And the first thing, therefore, would be to define exactly what success would look like over the 4-year period. I would want to co-create that vision with yourselves as the IDC and also with my fellow commissioners and the Secretariat, FCDO as the sponsoring department. But I do think that the context for our work has changed, so it's important to be really clear what it is that the additional value that that ICAI is adding to the aid, to the scrutiny ecosystem. So that would be my overarching priority. There's a short-term imperative which lays the foundations, which is to determine a work plan to minimise the gap in scrutiny that's arisen between the 2 commissions and to build a pipeline of well-focused thematic reviews that can support the committee in its inquiries and rebuild momentum for building evidence of aid impact and learning as we move forward. So that would be a priority. The next foundational priority would be building the relationships. ICAI does its work in the context of different relationships, and so being visible, understanding how we add value, where we complement, we don't replicate, and where we collaborate. So that would also be an important priority to launch, as it were. And then a 4th priority would be to look at operations and make sure that we as ICAI were getting the best possible outcomes and impact from the resources and leverage that we have at our disposal.
Okay, and what thematic or geographical areas of UK ODA spending do you see as priorities for scrutiny, and why?
Goodness, there's a lot of competition. There'd need to be some clear criteria for deciding where we focus in terms of geographies, and one of those would be materiality, so how much UK assistance is going to different parts of the world. So Afghanistan, I think, will remain very important in that regard because it's still a very large programme. I think we would also want to look at those geographies that are affected by protracted crises, prolonged crises. So that points to Sudan, to Syria again, to Gaza, where humanitarian assistance is very, very important. So those would be two criteria that would be used and 2 geographies that would be related two sets of geographies that would be related.
Thank you. David?
Thank you, Chair. Jillian, thank you for being with us and answering our questions today. So, given the delays in the recruitment process, having a handover with the previous Chief Commissioner isn't going to be possible. And it's going to be essential to sort of hit the ground running. And I'm sure you've got lots of experience in this from previous roles, but what will you do specifically to make sure that you can offset against not having a handover and really get down to the job as quickly as possible?
Yeah. Well, in a sense, as you say, it's a disadvantage not to have had a handover, but I think it's very clear to me that the Secretariat and my fellow commissioners have not been sitting waiting for a Chief Commissioner to arrive. There's been a lot of foundational work that's been done. So in that sense, I think the ground has been set for me to hit the ground running should I be nominated, should I be confirmed. When I look at the situation and having worked as I have recently as a consultant, I think it's very important to look at what's urgent and important, what only the Chief Commissioner can do that needs to be an immediate focus in terms of getting business moving, and then to have a more structured plan around what are the other things that need to be in place to kind of think about the fourth commission as a four-year phase. So it would be a kind of twin track approach where I would kind of have some structure around that. And the reason for doing that is to guard against information overload and feeling that I was being pulled in too many different directions, but to take a strategic overview right from the get-go. I seek feedback and I would ask questions and be curious about how things are done, and try to use consultation to make sure that I was focused and invite feedback if I needed to course correct along that way.
Good, thank you.
Alice?
Thanks very much, Jillian. What do you see as the biggest risk currently facing ICI, and how will you manage it?
When I've thought about risks, I guess I've thought about three buckets, and that means I'll start with one that isn't the biggest one, but just to give you a sense of how I'm thinking about that. In terms of existential risks, I don't see any immediate crisis on the horizon. I think the International Development Act states that there's a responsibility to evaluate independently the aid programme. So I think in terms of, I think the ICI is secure. I think there is an immediate risk in terms of sequencing the various different things that are being established in the scrutiny architecture. So in developing a work plan, I would want to make sure that that was agile enough to take into account the fact that the government is setting its priorities, the 3 reviews that it's commissioned, and that things might change, because of course we would want to be very strategically aligned with government priorities and evaluating and reviewing those things that the government has said it will do and will contribute to. So I think there's a sort of, it's more of a challenge than a risk. How do you make sure you've got a clear long-term set of objectives, but agility and flexibility within that, given that other things are changing. And that would include, of course, your own programme for inquiries and the public consultation that is helping to set those for the IDC at the moment. The third, so that would be the strategic bucket of risks. The third bucket of risks is operational. Again, I don't see that as acute, but I would want to get to grips with particularly making sure that we aren't that we're not limited by heavy transaction costs, and so kind of understanding how we are working effectively and efficiently with the FCDO as a sponsoring department, so that as commissioners, as we commit to what ICI will do, that we are actually in a good position to deliver and over-deliver.
Thank you. And you touched with your last point on the operational side. In the previous commission, ICI has had some uncertainty around budget and long periods of understaffing. So could you expand a little bit on the steps you would take to ensure that it does have the resources that it needs going forward?
Yeah. Well, I guess in an ideal world, we would have a 4-year funding commitment, and we would have, there is, in advance, the planning process would mean that we didn't find ourselves in that position. That depends on the FCDO's planning processes. I think the last commission, it was, there was some unusual factors around the merger where ICI, fell into the crosshairs of some of those systems coming together. That's not to say that I would be complacent about needing to communicate and over-communicate and make sure that we were planning and being patient and persistent and realistic, but not, but being persistent and making sure we did have what we needed. And as I understand it from the conversations that I've had, it had been very important to have had the support of this committee in unlocking some of those bottlenecks. So being anticipatory based on the learning that we've had so far, not taking anything for granted and keeping on top as a secretariat with what needs to happen and when, and taking things up at the right level when it's needed, when that is when that risk becomes more acute.
Thank you. We finished. Yeah. First, I'd be interested to hear how you define impact, what that looks like to you. But then, could I ask you to just reflect on which of ICAI's recent reviews you think have achieved the greatest impact and why that is?
Yeah. So, I suppose at its simplest form, impact is change. It needs to be strategic, it needs to be sustainable, and in the business of international development, it needs to advance those issues that the people who are most affected care about most in the ways that they say will make the biggest difference to them. For ICAI, defining impact is really doing its job as one piece of a more complex system. So it's putting robust, rigorous, relevant, clearly factual information, objectively and independently, to the committee, to Parliament more widely, to do its job, and also in the public domain, in order that we can then have an impact on future policy programmes and practice. So for ICAI to show impact, we need to be able to demonstrate that we are valued and that we're contributing to the broader processes of increasing the impact of aid, making sure it reaches the people it's supposed to reach, and giving the assurance to the UK public that we're doing that in a way that the UK is doing that, and the government's doing it in a way that delivers value for money. I think I might have missed the second part of your question.
Reflecting on recent reviews that ICAI have done, which would you consider to have had that impact, and why?
The one that looks at the costs of refugees in the UK, I think, is probably a very, very clear example of where ICAI has, alongside others, put into the public domain something that wasn't really known, something that needed to be understood because most people had not understood, most of us had not understood that the ODA budget was being used for refugee costs in the UK, and of course also looking at the value for money of that and finding that it was there was more than a little room for improvement. So I think that's a really clear example of ICAI playing its part, and then obviously that was then complementary to the inquiry that the IDC did and also further work that the NAO did. So I think that's one good example. Another example that springs to mind is the work looking at BII in India, and that was more about follow-up, so looking at whether or not the actual recommendations had been turned into action. So that's obviously another clear indicator of impact, not only that we're putting evidence out there to improve scrutiny, but that scrutiny turns into action and lessons and improvement in the real world.
But I think you're touching on this already, but do you think that ICAI can increase its impact?
I think any public body should be seeking always to increase its impact. I have thought about this a little bit, quite a lot. I've thought about how would we know if ICAI was increasing its impact. So we've got, there's a theory of change with key performance indicators that are on ICAI's website. I would want to refresh that, but I can see that impact at the moment is measured through, the number of reviews done, the number of recommendations made and accepted and followed through, and that's very important. That's a very sensible way to measure impact. I would want to be looking then at whether we could do more of that for less cost, how the business model is arranged, not because I think that there's necessarily a problem that's leaping out of there, but because I think there's always a duty to try and squeeze more value out of contracted services, for example, and look at the balance of what could be done in-house and what can be done through contractors to make sure we're getting the best combination in the business model. So that would be one thing that could improve impact. I would be really keen to, I'm sure we'll come on to this, but to think about how we are both collaborating and working in a complementary way with this committee. That would be, again, it's not something that I see as broken that needs to be fixed, but it is something that it's a new context and it's a new committee, a new team of commissioners, so that would be a really important opportunity, I think, to see where do you see the greatest impact from ICAI's work, and how can we make sure that our approach is genuinely enhancing scrutiny and supporting Parliament to do its job.
You also said in your survey response that ICAI could look at improving the way it communicates findings. Yeah. Just wondering if you had any sort of specific ideas around how you might do that.
So I'm interested in the extent to which the approach to the strategic communications approach, so looking at the Commission as a 4-year Commission, so what would be different as a result of having a 4th Commission than is now, building on the legacy of the first 3 commissions. And I think one thing that we could do is, look at how strategic that communications approach has been, by which I mean there's obviously a very good drumbeat of putting review findings and activities in the public domain, being very transparent, seeking to engage. But I wonder if there are ways of expanding some of those audiences. I'm going to be keen to understand how the Secretariat segments its audiences. And just to give you a concrete example, it would be understanding things like whether or not we are meeting the needs of the APPGs as well as the International Development Committee and other MPs and the Lords, of course. So looking at the sort of, from an audience perspective, from a user perspective, are the kinds of products that we're developing at the moment meeting the right range of needs, the right time in the right way, to expand our impact through that leverage.
Do you have any sort of... I appreciate a lot of your answers today. There's a sort of caution because, quite rightly, you don't want to preempt anything, and I think also you want to work collegiately and bring a lot of people on board. But do you have any kind of personal sense, I suppose, of where you would like to take ICAI in achieving that?
I do. I mean, I would have a vision, and you're right, that would be something that I would want to co-create, but I would definitely be coming with some ideas. So if I were to sort of think 4 years on, if I'm confirmed and I've been privileged enough to do this role, what would be the things I would point to that were different and had increased impact? If I could have my wish list, it would be making sure that ICAI's statutory footing is really, really firm. So where the International Development Act says that it's that there has to be independent evaluation, I would like to see ICAI's name in there, because we had demonstrated such value that it was an obvious thing that ICAI needed to exist, and in the future I would like to see ICAI on a 4-year financial secure footing, because that does just make you more efficient. It means you can plan, you can be strategic, you know what resources you have, and that means that you can flex much more as well. So that would kind of be one area of what I would like to see. I think I would like to see us being able to collect more evidence of material impact. So that, in practice, how would I do that? That would be looking at different ways of measuring the influence that we do have through the reports. I'm saying we, which is a bit presumptuous, but thinking myself into the role. So that would be one area, and I think I've already mentioned expanding reach into audiences and getting the feedback that that's really, really valued for its objectivity, for its independence, and for the turning recommendations into actual action, because at the end of the day that's what we're about. It's about being able to do more with the resource that we have, both as ICAI but also as the UK in the international development sector, and it's so important when one of the biggest challenges is going to be filling the funding gap for the world to do development, and also the political will that's needed to address the extent of problems that there are. Yeah.
Monica.
Thank you, and you're doing a very good job at ignoring all the noise outside and concentrating on us. I want to congratulate you for that. I just want to also push, you talked a lot about strategically what you would do and the outputs that you want to see. Can I just ask you, is there anything operationally that you would change about the way ICAI operates that you would consider changing in your tenure?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that I would look at the theory of change and say, can we be ambitious in terms of, at the moment we're reporting to the IDC at a sort of at an outcome level, but I think and I'm sure that previous commissioners have also sought to achieve this in different times, but it is a new context now. So I think we'd like to be able to say right at the get-go, where do we want to be at the end of the 4-year commission, and let's be open and ambitious about that. And that might mean that we look at a range of things. So we absolutely offer this, but we're striving to go beyond that offer and really push ourselves to deliver even greater impact. I think one of the sort of unintended consequences of being very open about what you're trying to achieve is that you don't want to be seen to fail. So I think that would be, I would want to think creatively about how do we push ourselves in the system, because we do have to demonstrate value, and there needs to be some material way of showing that. So having really clear metrics for being open about how we're doing and what we're delivering, what changes we're making, and then being creative about what methodologies we might use to gather compelling, engaging evidence on that would be one area I've thought about.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Chair. ICAI's independence from government is central to its existence. If at any point you saw that independence being eroded in any way, what would you do to bring it back and also protect it if you were appointed?
I think that's kind of one of the first tasks of the Chief Commissioner. And you're right, the independence is there. It is the independent committee, but I think it's important never to be complacent about that, even though, as we were talking about risk earlier, I don't see it as an immediate risk. I think the way you manage that is it's do not say. So in terms of, maybe I'll talk about protecting first and then come back to the question about what I would do if I felt it was being eroded. In terms of protecting it, we report to you, and I would be seeking to be scrutinised and interrogated on the independence, the objectivity, and the independence of the conduct and the work of the commissioners in leading the reviews. I'm very conscious that loss of independence doesn't just necessarily spring up one day. It can be kind of quite a sort of a process of erosion through the way that you're working. And I think because I've worked in government, I've conducted reviews, I've been subject to reviews and felt the impact of ICAI's reviews, I think I'm quite attuned. I've been out of government for a long time, but I have tacit understanding of where some of those pressures come from that can lead to a dilution of review findings. And so I think that is something that I'm very alive to. I think the perception of independence is obviously as important as robust independence itself, and I can imagine that there might be situations where ICAI's independence is challenged publicly or privately, and in those cases it would be the job of the Chief Commissioner to set the record straight. I would be absolutely clear that as commissioners we're across the facts, because I think that's the absolute non-negotiable, is that we have our facts right. We need to do that for the independence, we need to do that for to be shown to be trustworthy for yourselves and other members of Parliament who would be relying on us in order to stand up and make the case for aid, as well as aid effectiveness and aid impact. Does that answer your question?
It does indeed. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Can I ask you how you'll seek to build and maintain a good working relationship with the FCDO and the other ODA spending departments?
Yes. I mean, I think that the first thing is to be really clear that we are complementary parts of the same system with the same shared objective. In terms of building relationships, understanding what objectives, particularly what the IDC is seeking to achieve, and how we can make sure that we are aligned, but also looking at what FCDO is delivering for government and that we're aligned with government objectives. So in terms of building the relationship, I would want to be really clear that we were adding value, not replicating, and that we were supporting those scrutiny processes and not replicating things that happen within FCDO, for example.
Sometimes people don't like attention being drawn to things that haven't worked out or haven't been cost effective, and yet these are the people that you have to have a relationship with. So how do you manage that situation?
So you listen to understand, you seek to understand that as a reality. Of course, I've been reviewed and it's not a comfortable process, and so in terms of thinking about the objectives, it's making sure that it's very clear that review is, yes, it's to hold to account, but it's also in terms of learning. So how do you then, you can't improve, you can't have the assurance that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing if you haven't got the evidence that tells you you are, and that independence evidence is a valuable thing. There will be pushback, so there will be, candid conversations where it's necessary to, to make sure everyone has the same understanding of why we're doing what we're doing, and then, obviously listening to understand, but that doesn't necessarily mean changing the approach or changing the recommendations. I think one key respectful strategy is no surprises. Obviously, for government departments who are being reviewed, they would see the reviews, they would have the opportunity to respond to particularly any factual inaccuracies, and so the intention would be that they see the process as fair, and that they see us as treating them even-handedly within our mandate.
And how do you think that ICAI can best complement the scrutiny of this committee? I mean, you've touched on it in parts of other answers, but overall, how do you think you can best complement this committee's work?
Yeah, we do different things. So I think ICAI's reviews tend to be longer, more in depth. We have resources to do that way, and so I think we can align the work plans. Obviously, we'd be bringing a long list for the work plan to the IDC for agreement. And making sure that what we were doing had a deeper, rigorous evidence base for the IDC to use. The IDC, I think we would, we don't have the teeth as ICAI, so being able to review the evidence and bring ministers and government departments to comment on and discuss the evidence through inquiries is obviously a really important way in which we make sure that recommendations are followed through and are taken up and turned into action.
So you ensure that this committee is able to sign off ICAI's first work programme under your leadership in a timely manner?
That would definitely be the intention. And we talked earlier about the risk of the transition. So I think there's already a couple of reviews, terms of reference underway to minimise the gap in scrutiny. The public consultation has taken place, which means that there is a long list. And so my understanding is that the commissioners and the Secretariat are ready to start that conversation, and that this appointment is a key factor in that.
Excellent. Is there anything anybody else would like to ask Jillian? Jillian, is there anything that you would like to say that we haven't otherwise covered in our questions?
They're very fair questions. I've enjoyed the conversation, and thank you. I think you've given me a good opportunity to help you see what you would get to work with.
I'm certainly very positive about your succinctness in terms of us being able to ask questions and you answering them in a succinct manner. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
And thank you for putting up with the musical backdrop.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.